My name's Susan and I'm a clinical psychologist who's worked with people with persistent pain and long-term health conditions for many years. This presentation is going to spend the next 5 minutes or so thinking about something I think that people with persistent pain often forget, and that's the need to develop a kindness towards yourself and the suffering that you might be going through on a daily basis. I think a good life is often about having balance. And it's really difficult to get balance when we have something that's out of our control and that hurts us on a regular basis. What happens to our lives when the balance is thrown out by something like having persistent pain? Well, I think what happens is that we're unable really to think about all the things that are important to us and mean a lot to us. And our focus often just goes on the threat of pain and having pain and what that means to our everyday lives if it comes along or gets worse. What happens when persisting pain comes into our lives is that often people get caught in a battle with their bodies, and I think they forget about all the other important things in their lives, how they are, what they want to be, what they want to achieve. And often I think this gets expressed through people feeling very frustrated or irritated with their bodies, and that sometimes kind of tips onto the people around them. So if we have ongoing pain, how does our brain react to this? I think often our brains really think that the stimulus that comes into our brain that is then understood as a need to protect our bodies with ongoing pain is a threat. And actually our brains only really understand one type of threat. And that threat is, well, made up from our senses and things that come in from our bodies, such as temperature, pressure, chemicals, and from our minds and the histories that we have that has gone before us. And by that, I mean things like thoughts and stories that we've stored up about what's happened to us because of pain or as a result of pain, things like memories, things like predictions, things like images of what's happened to us in the past and judgments we have about that. All this information goes into our brain, and the brain's job is to really understand whether this is a threat or not. If the brain thinks it's a threat, then it activates something called the sympathetic nervous system. And this system is all about getting us ready to fight, to run away, or to keep us still so that we can survive what's going on in that situation. But the trouble with this is it produces adrenaline and cortisol, and these bodily substances drive up our threat levels and keep us kind of always looking out for something. And I think that's what people with persistent pain often experience, this idea that pain might always come along and that they always have to keep an eye open for it. If the brain doesn't think that the information coming in is a threat, it activates something called the parasympathetic nervous system, and this puts us at ease. It reduces muscle tension, reduces heart rate, and makes us able to kind of want to connect socially. And I think that's important to remember. Often if we're in this constant state of threat, that actually our brains don't want us to be open to things, they want us to get away from the problem. Whereas if we can bring a sense of soothing to ourselves or a sense of kindness to ourselves, then we can activate this system that kind of down-regulates all our bodily processes. Is pain and emotion linked? I suppose is my real question. There's loads of research to say that it is. There's lots of research on things like osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, fibromyalgia, that show that people who experience more negative emotions then go on to report more pain. So we know that there's a bit of a link between emotions. Now I want to point out now, I don't blame emotions for pain, and I don't think we could get rid of emotions so we could then get rid of our pain. I think what we need to do is think, okay, well, what makes pain worse and how can we manage that if we can't get rid of the pain? Also, there was a change in the way that medicine views pain about 10-ish years ago. And instead of it just being a physical bodily event, they began describing it as an unpleasant sensory, i.e. bodily, and emotional experience. And I think that's the first time in all my kind of 30-odd years of working in persistent pain that I think that medicine has acknowledged that there's this emotional element to what happens to us when we have pain. So if pain and emotions are linked and we can't solve the pain, what could we do to make our lives a bit better and to introduce a more kind and compassionate kind of stance towards ourselves when we have persisting pain? Well, Paul Gilbert, he's a man who really is the founding father of this idea about being compassionate to yourself, or using compassionate focused therapy, suggests that we've got 3 emotional regulation systems. And what's really important, like I mentioned early on about balance in our lives, what's really important with these emotional regulation systems is that they're balanced, okay? And I think that if we think about our own experience of persistent pain and what that does to our systems, as I said earlier, it drives up our threat mechanisms, or the meaning of threat, or it makes us more sensitized to information coming in. And I think people with persistent pains often have quite big developed threat systems. But the trouble, Paul Gilbert tells us, with having one system that's very dominant over the others is that, like a stool with 3 legs, if one of the legs is much bigger than the others, you don't get any balance. And Paul Gilbert tells us that actually we need this balance between all 3 of these systems. So we need threat because we need to understand if we're in a situation where we need to get away. And that's not just pain, that's everything in our life. That goes from being chased by a tiger to your credit card bill coming through the front door. Then we need equal balance with our drive system. And the drive system is all about thinking about you in a wider sense, what you want to do with your life, who you want to be in your life. And then equal balance with the soothing system. And the soothing system is about down-regulating all of the systems that feed threat, interestingly. So the soothing system, once it's activated, will allow people to slow down, it stops digestion, it promotes hormones that keep us calm and make us feel safe, and helps us to connect with others. So Paul Gilbert, and me actually, think that this system really does need to be in balance. And what I would say to you is, you don't have to do it now, but maybe spend a minute or 2 outside of this talk thinking about how your 3 systems are in relation to each other. And if you've got one very dominant system, that might tell you that the other 2 might need a bit of attention. And when we get this balance, I think our emotions are better regulated. If our emotions are better regulated, our pain can also be better regulated. Well, that's part of the theory. So how can we develop compassion towards ourselves and others? Compassion is defined as a sensitivity to suffering and distress of ourselves and others, with a commitment to try and alleviate and prevent this. And it's really understandable how people with persistent pain might feel they've run out of compassion for themselves, maybe others too, because, this constant battle with, what if the pain gets worse? Should I rest all day today? Should I go out? This constant kind of questioning about their pain and its effects on their lives. So what do we need to do to grow compassion towards ourselves and other people around us? Well, the first thing is to have courage. It's really difficult to live with something that's so unpredictable and painful on a daily basis. And I think turning towards this idea that you have pain and it causes you distress, rather than just kind of pushing it away, takes a great deal of courage. And I think we need wisdom. And I think the wisdom really comes about because we need to think about what it is, how we're going to get the best course of action, what's going to help us the most, and how we can come towards this best course of action with a sense of kindness. So this slide, and I'm going to acknowledge this slide is a fairly busy slide, makes an attempt to think about ways that you might cultivate a sense of kindness and compassion towards yourself. And I'm going to invite you to come back and look at this slide later on as well, because actually there's quite a lot to think about on it. But in essence, it's about letting go of self-blame. It's really easy to blame ourselves when we're not in control of something like persistent pain. Developing more of a kind inner voice to ourselves, and we'll talk about the inner critic in a moment or 2. Really down-regulating your threat system through calming, soothing activities, and noticing when you're caught up in a battle and choosing something that steps you away from the battle, a kinder response to what's happening to you and what's happening to your life. So, just a quick note about self-criticism. I suppose it's the antithesis of compassion and self-kindness. The inner critic is really important to us. If we didn't have an inner critic, someone who, an internal voice, that's your voice, that drives you forward with things, I think it would have been very easy for mankind to be snuffed out. So from an evolutionary perspective, we needed inner critics to drive us forward and keep us alive. But I suppose my question is, how powerful is your inner critic? Lots of people just see this inner voice as a curse. You know, I've got this really strong internal critic. It tells me off all the time, it tells me I'm not good enough, it tells me I should do something else about my pain. But I suppose the thing I would try and encourage you to do is to think about where it might be a blessing for you also. Because actually, we all need an inner critic. Otherwise, we might not get out of bed in the morning. But this inner critic is learned over time. Children don't arrive on the planet understanding that they've got an internal hostile voice. And it's quite protective because it can prevent criticism from others. It can prevent kind of abandonment from others. So it's quite useful at times. And it really does drive us to do a better job to improve our performance. But it can become really unhelpful when it's too strong, and it can have quite a direct physical impact. It can make your muscle tension worse. It can drive up your heart rate. And because of this, it can influence your pain. And if it can influence your pain, it can influence your threat, which throws our emotional regulation systems out. And self-criticism can be really unhelpful if it's allowed to become too strong. It can have a direct impact upon our physical ability in as much as it can create muscle tension, it can drive up your heart rate and your blood pressure. And this can in turn make your brain think more threat is there. And when more threat is there, the brain might try and protect you with more pain. And self-criticism stimulates the same brain region as actual criticism, which can often invoke awful feelings like shame and guilt. And I think that also is then represented in the brain as a type of threat. So we just need to be careful. We don't want to get rid of the inner critic. We just want to temporize your inner critic and use it when it's useful, and then try to just leave it when it's not. So this slide looks at the big three of mindful compassion. And these three things are things that we will explore whilst we're on the programme looking at pain management. The first skill is that of mindfulness. And this is really an invitation for people to learn skills to be able to notice without judgment. And notice when they're experiencing things like stress and disappointment, and notice when their mood is shifting, and to use that wisdom we talked about earlier on to make good choices as to what they're going to do in the moment when they notice these changes. Then there's kindness. And kindness, from our perspective, is about being able to switch to an empathetic, understanding and supportive inner voice, and finding empathetic and understanding solutions to the problems you're facing in each moment. And the third one is about connection. Connection is really tough when we've got chronic pain, especially if we have kind of associated mood problems, because actually, you know, the last thing we want to do is engage with people. Maybe we just want to withdraw and keep our suffering to ourselves. But actually the research shows us that, you know, connection helps people with long-term pain. Connection helps people with mood issues. So actually the more that we can connect, perhaps the better we might be able to access the other parts of our lives that pain may have held us back from. So can we change the balance in our soothing systems? You know, building up our soothing strategies, things that we're going to try whilst on the programme, will revolve around things like breathing, relaxation, use of imagery, cultivating a compassionate inner voice, trying to think of ourselves as our compassionate best and what we might look like, and developing the use of visualization to help us feel safe, might turn down those levels of threat and might help us emotionally regulate more effectively. And then mindfulness, there's quite a few different types of mindfulness we're going to explore. There's a focused type of mindfulness that uses calming breathing techniques. There's explorative mindfulness, which helps us think about things like mindful eating and what effect that has on us. There's skills to help us open up to who we are and pay attention to what's going on in each moment without judgment. And then there's some directed mindfulness, specifically a meditation based on loving kindness. So that was a really quick whistle-stop tour of compassionate focused therapy and moving towards kindness with persistent pain. But before we go, I just want to acknowledge living with pain is no easy thing. It takes a huge amount of courage and strength and resilience every single day to live alongside the pain that you have. Bringing compassion to this challenge can unlock a path to less suffering along your way. So here's my challenge. Look it up. Practice the stuff we give you on the programme. see if you can be a bit kinder to yourself.